Whisper Creek Studios.
Here in Appalachia, folklore and superstition have always walked side by side. Most folks won't admit to believe in every story they hear, but they'll still glance over their shoulder when the sun drops behind the ridge. And the truth is, most of these mountain stories don't come from nowhere. If you follow them back far enough, you'll usually find something real at the center. Maybe not every detail, maybe not every version, but something happened, and over time, as the years pass and the stories get handed down from one porch to another, the edges change. Details get added. Names get softened or mispronounced. But the core of it, that usually stays put. And that's the way it is with this one. Like a lot of mountain stories, this one has more than one beginning. Some say it traces back to bank robbing. Some say buried treasure in the woods. Others tie it to the Civil War. But no matter how it starts, it always ends the same. Before we get into this episode, if you're drawn to true stories from Appalachia, the kind rooted in history, folklore, crime, and things that people don't always say out loud, then you're in the right place. This is Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast. We release new episodes every Saturday, and if you decide to stay, go ahead and press that follow button. That way these stories don't have to come looking for you. This episode takes us to Taylor's Valley, just outside of Trail Town, USA, Damascus, Virginia, tucked into the far southwestern corner near the Tennessee border. The mountains around it are silent in a way that feels older than the road leading into it. And when you come down off that last rise and the land opens up in front of you, it surprises you a little, if you've never been there before. I didn't think I had. I'd been near it. I'd passed through the area, but I don't think I'd ever stopped there and stood long enough to really take it in. So, I went there. Not because I expected something to happen. Not because I was looking for a ghost story. Well, I went because if I'm going to tell you a story rooted in a place, I want to see the ground it stands on. It's beautiful country. And it's also the setting for one of the most persistent legends in this part of Southwest Virginia. Now, I'll be honest with you, I had never heard this story before until recently. That surprised me, because it's close to home. Close enough that I feel like I should have heard it growing up. But sometimes stories live in pockets. They remain in certain areas, certain families, certain circles. This one did. It is well known there, enough that someone even wrote a song about it. The Yates brothers, and recently bluegrass singer Martha Spencer recorded the song called Creekfield Woman. She was gracious enough to let me use a short portion of that song in this episode. You'll get to hear that later at the end. But first, you need to understand the place. The Creeper Trail runs through Taylor's Valley. Today, it's known as a rail-to-trail system, one of the most popular cycling routes in the region. You can shuttle up towards White Top or Green Cove Station, then ride all the way down through the trestles, across the mountain streams, through tunnels of trees, all the way back into the town of Damascus. It's a beautiful ride, but before it was a trail, it was a railroad. The Virginia-North Carolina Railway began taking shape in the 1890s after earlier failed attempts to push a line through these mountains. By the early 1900s, it was successfully completed and extended into North Carolina, moving timber and other goods out of the high country. They called it the Virginia Creeper. Partly because it had to move so slow climbing the grades that locals called them creepers, and maybe partly because of the native Virginia creeper vine that grows thick in these parts. Before the railroad, though, that corridor was something else. Long before steel rails, it was a footpath, used by Native Americans traveling through the mountains. Later it became a wagon route, that narrow cut through the stretch of land that had carried people for a long time. And that's important, because this story starts before the railroad. It starts during the Civil War. The Civil War ran from 1861 to 1865. In Washington County, Virginia, where Taylor's Valley sits, sent men into multiple regiments. The 37th Virginia Infantry, known as the Virginia Mountain Boys. The 50th Virginia Infantry, known as the Bloody Half Hundred. The 21st and 22nd Virginia Mounted Cavalry, and many others. They were all folded into the Army of Northern Virginia and fought in some of the bloodiest battles of the war. Some of those units were nearly wiped out, with only a handful remaining at the end of the war, and the ones that did survive, no doubt saw their fair share of death and destruction. Now in Taylor's Valley, before the railroad, before tourism, there was a small cabin, a husband and wife living there, Mr. and Mrs. Creekfield. No children that anyone remembers, just the two of them. When the war came, he left. That's what men did. If you were able-bodied, you went. The home guard stayed behind, usually older men and boys too young to fight, and their job was to keep order, watch for deserters, and protect what was left of the community. But if you could fight, you were expected to, so Mr. Creekfield went. And like so many women in those mountains, Miss Creekfield stayed. Farms didn't stop because there was a war. Crops still had to be planted, animals fed, wood chopped. Life didn't pause just because the country was tearing itself apart. At some point during the war, word came back that Mr. Creekfield had been killed, or missing, or presumed dead. Records weren't always clean. Communication wasn't always fast. News traveled by letter, by rider, or by rumor. However the news came, Miss Creekfield believed that her husband wasn't coming home, like so many other men in this part of the mountain. And that's where the story begins to turn. Grief has a way of rearranging a person's world, especially in a place that is isolated. You don't have crowds. You don't have distractions. You have long stretches of quiet, work, and memories. Now, during the war, a local man from the home guard, Joseph, had been helping around the community. That was common. When the able-bodied men left, someone had to check in on the livestock, the fences, the widows, and the families trying to hold things together. That wasn't part of their official duty, but in some southern communities, that's just what they did. Joseph came by from time to time to visit Miss Creekfield. At first it was practical, checking on the place, offering help, splitting wood, bringing supplies if he had them, all while secretly looking for deserters. Over time, Joseph started hanging around longer, coming by more often. Conversations turned into companionship, and eventually companionship turned into something more. And for a woman who believed she had lost her husband in a war that seemed endless, Joseph felt like something was trying to return to normal. Now, nobody knows if they ever married. The story doesn't say that. It just says they were together, and in a small mountain community, that was enough for people to notice. Then, April 1865 came. The war ended at Appomattox Courthouse. But news didn't travel instantly. Weeks passed before the reality of it reached every corner of the mountains. Soldiers didn't appear home the next day. Many walked for weeks to get back to their farms and to their homes. And one day, without warning, Mr. Creekfield, thought dead, walked back into Taylor's Valley. The man Miss Creekfield believed to be dead was standing right in front of her. And in an instant, everything she thought she knew was shattered. And by all accounts, she was stunned, relieved, overwhelmed. It was the kind of thing that normally doesn't happen in one's lifetime. A husband thought to be dead, returning home. At first, things seemed to return to normal. Mr. Creekfield resumed working around the farm, took up his tools again, began repairing what had gone unattended for years. But war changes people. It has a way of reshaping a man long before he ever steps foot back onto his own porch. The Civil War didn't just scar the fields at Antietam or stain the rivers at Shiloh. It followed men home. It stayed with them in the smell of smoke that never quite left their clothes, in the thunder of artillery that seemed to roll through their sleep years later. Boys marched off in wool uniforms behind brass bands, believing in cause and country. What came back were men who had stood in the mud thick with blood, who had heard the cries of the wounded long into the night, who had learned how quickly a friend could fall and how thin the space between living and dying really was. And the neighbors had noticed that change in him. He wasn't loud about it. Mr. Creekfield wasn't angry in public. If anything, he seemed folded inward, watching more than speaking. His eyes would drift to the doorways, to the tree lines, to the shadows at the edge of the yard, as if part of him never quite left the battlefield. And like a lot of men from that war, he found himself reaching for something to tame it. Back then, no one talked about shell shock, PTSD, or trauma. They just said a man was different. And sometimes, you think the easiest way to dampen the noise of war in one's head was with a bottle. Whiskey dulled the memory for a few hours, blurred the faces he saw in his head, softened the sound of cannon fire that still echoed when the house went still at night. But it never erased it. It only pushed it down, and Mr. Creekfield found himself reaching for more and more, for he had become dependent on the whiskey. Eventually, the rumors reached him. Rumors that while he was gone, off to fight for his country, his wife hadn't been alone. At first, he dismissed it as gossip, but like a lot of things that settle into a man's mind after trauma, the thought began to fester and grow inside his mind. At some point, Mrs. Creekfield told him the truth. She told him she believed he was dead. She thought her life had ended in one way and was trying to build it again another. By some versions, he didn't explode. He didn't shout. He didn't strike her. He just absorbed it and turned deeper into the bottle. Weeks passed, maybe months. He worked. She worked. Life in the valley carried on. But something had broken in him, and one afternoon, the way it's told, they were outside the cabin splitting wood, getting ready for winter. Work that had to be done whether a marriage was struggling or not. She would set the logs upright. He would bring the axe down. Rhythm, repetition. And at one point, she bent forward to steady a log that had rolled slightly off the chopping block. Her head lowered. His axe was already in motion. The story says it happened in a single swing. Whether it was rage, whether it was impulse, whether it was a mind cracked open by years of war, humiliation, and grief. No one can say, but the blow landed, and she died right there. Sudden. No argument leading up to it, no drawn-out voice, just one moment that could not be undone. After her death, the story says he buried her on the property, not in a graveyard, not in a cemetery, just there on the land that they had worked. That part isn't unusual for the time. Remote areas didn't always have easy access to established graveyards, so family buried their own. But what made this one different was what followed. In Appalachia, during that time, there were women known for certain things. They weren't called witches openly, not in the daylight anyway, but people knew who to go to when sickness would linger for too long, when livestock kept dying, when a baby wouldn't sleep, when other things went wrong. These women carried herbs, knowledge passed down, scripture mixed with superstition and old mountain ways, and according to some, one of those women came to the cabin after the burial. Not to accuse, not to expose, but because she had sensed that something tragic had happened in the mountain, and it needed to be contained. She walked the property, stood over the place where the earth had been turned, and she told Mr. Creekfield something simple, that what had happened there needed to stay there, that the ground had to remain undisturbed, that if the grave was broken open, if the earth was moved, what was beneath it wouldn't remain at rest. And then, as if nothing had ever happened, Mr. Creekfield went back to working around the cabin and the farm. That's the part that bothers people, because eventually folks would have noticed Miss Creekfield wasn't around anymore. Taylor's Valley wasn't busy, but it wasn't empty either. People crossed paths at church, along the trail. Word traveled slowly, but it traveled. And when someone asked where she was, the explanation was simple. He said she had gone to live with relatives. He said the years of war had finally taken a toll on their marriage and that she needed time. And in 1865, that wouldn't have sounded unusual. Families were scattered after the war. People relocated. Women often returned to kinfolk if things at home weren't going well. If he said she left like that, that likely settled it. And there's another truth that's harder to admit. In that era, in that time, a husband's word carried weight. If he said his wife had gone, most people wouldn't have pressed him further. So she stopped being seen, stopped appearing, stopped coming to church, stop standing in the doorway of their cabin. And after a while, people adjusted. But there's always one. There was at least one neighbor, an older woman, the story says, who never quite believed him. She said she'd seen the way his wife looked when she thought he was dead. She'd seen the way that Joseph had been coming around during the war. And she noticed something else. After the husband returned, that Joseph stopped coming around too. He didn't just keep his distance. He disappeared. Some say he left the area. Some say there was a confrontation between the two men that no one spoke about afterward. But no one can point to a grave. No one can point to a record. He was just gone. And that adds another layer. Because if one person disappears in a region recovering from war, people can accept it. If two disappear within months of each other, and the same man remains standing in the middle of it, steady and working his land, that sits differently. But in that time, stepping into another man's household carried risk. The people kept their doubt to themselves. That's how absence works in small places. It doesn't make noise. It just becomes normal. And for decades, nothing changed. The cabin aged, seasons passed, and along with it, so did Mr. Creekfield. Whatever was buried there remained buried. That is, until the railroad came. Outside money and outside ambition decided a railroad line would come through Taylor's Valley. Timber had value, and the mountains were no longer going to sit untouched. First it was the survey crews, then the engineers, and then men with blasting power. Steel doesn't follow superstition. It follows grade, and when they mapped the most efficient route through the valley, it cut straight through the land that once belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Creekfield. Earth was moved, trees cleared, rocks blasted. And if there was a grave there, without a headstone, without a fence, without a church record, it wouldn't have been recognized as a grave at all. To a railroad crew, it would have just looked like ground that needed leveling. So the line was laid, and whatever had been buried there had become disturbed. The day I went to Taylor's Valley to prep for this episode, it had been raining most of the day. The roads were still wet. The sky hung low and gray. It wasn't raining anymore, but the air had that damp weight to it, the kind that feels settled into the hills and doesn't lift. You drive up the mountain most of the way there. At one point, you dip briefly into Tennessee before crossing back into Virginia. It's a steady climb through trees, and then all at once, you start back down the other side. Then, the valley opens up. Even though it was still daylight, it felt closer to dusk. A thin mist hung over the fields as I came down off the mountain. Flat fields stretched between the ridges. A river runs through it, big enough to look like a river by my standards, and a smaller stream comes down off the mountain to meet it. A handful of houses, a diner, a couple churches, a small community center, a park. It's not a town, it's a community. And you can feel that difference when you're there. Almost like I had gone back in time in a pleasant way. Seems things slower paced, relaxing. In the park sits an old railroad car. I stopped and read the sign. It was used by the maintenance crews back in the 1940s. Not when they were building the railroad. This was later. But when they were maintaining the line, they'd park it on a siding off the main track and live in it during the week. It had a stove inside, a primitive toilet. You can imagine them pulling water from the creek, cooking simple meals, walking before daylight to walk the tracks, checking spikes, replacing ties, and looking for anything that might cause a derailment. And that matters, because some of the strongest versions of this legend comes from the railroad workers. Men who were on that line every day. Men who knew what belonged there and what didn't. While I was there, I spoke with a couple walking down the road. Locals. Friendly folk. I asked them about Hurricane Helene, the storm that came through in September of 2024 and changed this community overnight. They told us their house had been swept off its foundation. The lady was inside when it happened. The flash flooding came fast. Water rushed down the mountains into these valleys, and what had been small streams become violent rivers in minutes. She was carried downstream in that house and survived. 16 hours before rescuers could reach her. Her husband, He was swept away separately and had to be rescued by helicopter. It's hard to describe what that storm did to these mountain communities. The rest of the country saw headlines, but standing there, talking to someone who'd lived through it, you realize how much geography shapes survival here. Water doesn't have anywhere to go but down, and when it comes off these ridges all at once, it brings everything with it. I did ask him about the Creekfield Woman. They knew the story. They even pointed me towards a waterfall not far from where I was standing, a place some say she'd been seen. I'll admit, I didn't press them for details. I wish I had. While I was there, something happened that felt fitting, even if it was just weather. The fog rolled in fast, not slow, not gradual. It moved across that land in a way that felt almost staged, though I know it wasn't. I was standing there filming, just taking in the place, and the mist thickened until the far side of the field blurred out. It didn't feel frightening, just older. Like the valley was reminding me it had been there longer than the railroad, longer than the trail, longer than any of us. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary related to this legend, but I understood why the story holds there. Because once you leave that small cluster of buildings and move along the creeper trail, which follows the old rail line, it gets remote fast. Trestles, narrow cuts through rock, long stretches where it's just you and the sound of water moving somewhere below. By the early 1900s, the railroad crews were the first ones willing to speak openly about what they had seen. In the early mornings, when the fog settled heavy along the grades and the motor cars moved slow across the tracks, they'd say they saw someone ahead of them on the line. At first, it looked just like a figure in white walking along the rails, and they would ring the bell or ease off the throttle, assuming it was someone who had just wandered too close. But by the time they rounded a bend or brought the car to a stop, the figure would be gone, and there would be no sign that anyone had stepped off the track at all. It was the kind of setting where small things stand out. Slow engines, damp air before sunrise, sound carrying farther than it should. And not long after the railroad was fully operating, the sightings became consistent. Reports of a woman in white, long black hair, sometimes carrying a lantern in one hand, and sometimes something else in the other. Her head. She wasn't running. She wasn't reaching for anyone. She was just there walking down the line, as if she were searching, like she was looking for something, or someone. That's really where the legend takes root, in working men saying they saw something they couldn't explain. And it didn't stay confined to the railroad. A generation later, long after the trains were running steady through Taylor's Valley, there was an old man who lived not far from the tracks. His family still talks about what he saw one morning before daylight while he was heading out to check his muskrat traps. He wasn't looking for anything unusual. It was just routine. Same paths he had walked hundreds of times, his lantern in his hand, frost still sitting low on the grass. As he came up the rise over the ridge, into his field, he saw someone standing along the tree line where the ground slopes towards the train track. At first, he thought it might be a neighbor cutting through his property, but she wasn't moving. She was just standing there, motionless, wearing a white dress, long dark hair hanging straight down, lantern in her hand, just standing there facing the tracks, looking up at the mountain. He said what struck him wasn't fear. He says it was as if she didn't seem lost. She seemed like she was waiting. He called out, not loud, just enough to let someone know they'd been seen. She never turned around. She didn't acknowledge him at all. And as he took a few steps closer, he blinked, and she was gone. Not running into the woods, not dropping down the slope, just gone. He stood there longer than he'd like to admit, lantern in his hand, staring at the place where she had been. The grass wasn't pressed down. The frost hadn't been disturbed. He finished checking his traps that morning. He didn't tell anyone right away what he had seen, but eventually he mentioned it to his wife. And she didn't laugh. She didn't ridicule him. She didn't make fun of him, because she herself had heard stories of the Creekfield Woman. And then there's the waterfall. The story of a grandfather from up on the mountain told his family that when he was younger, he had walked up near the falls late one afternoon and saw a woman sitting on a fallen log close to the water. She was brushing her long hair, pulling the brush through it in a slow, steady stroke, as somehow in rhythm with the water. He didn't think much of it at first. People sit by the water all the time. It was a place to rest. But something made him pause. He would later say that the air felt different that day, calmer than it should have been, as if the woods had pulled back a little. He took a step closer, maybe meaning to speak so he wouldn't startle her, and before he could say a word, the log was empty. No splash in the water, no footsteps moving into the brush, just the waterfall running the way it always had. And then there are the footsteps. Locals walking that same stretch of road at night have described hearing someone keeping pace behind them. Light, steady steps that matched their rhythm. When they slowed, the steps slowed. When they stopped, the steps stopped. And when they finally turned around to see who was there, the road would be empty. And more recently, just after Hurricane Helene tore through the area and the Creeper Trail was officially closed, a Forest Service worker not from this area, who wouldn't have known the story of the Creekfield Woman, was assigned to inspect the section near Taylor's Valley. The trail wasn't open to the public. No cyclists, no hikers, no casual visitors. If someone was out there, they weren't supposed to be. He'd arrived early, just before daylight, checking drainage and storm damage along the grade. The ground was still soft from the rain. The trail was quieter than had been in years. As he walked up the trail, over the trees, cutting through the brush, he saw someone standing further down near a bend. White clothing, long dark hair, just standing still. At first, he'd assumed it was a trespasser who hadn't got the notice that the trail was closed, so he called out. No response. He kept walking toward her. She didn't move, and just before he reached the curve in the path of the trail, she stepped sideways into the mist. Not hurriedly, not startled, just one simple step, and she was gone. But there was nowhere to step. Brush lined both sides of the trail. The ground was soft enough to show a footprint, but there was none. He didn't make a formal report. He didn't tell it broadly. He just simply refused to work that stretch of trail alone again. And over time, something else changed. Around 1977, when the railroad shut down and the steel was pulled up, the line went quiet. No more engines, no more crews walking the grade before daylight, just trees creeping back in and the steady sound of water moving through the valley. After that, people started saying she was seen less on the old rail bed and more near the waterfall. No one can prove the connection, but it makes a certain kind of sense. If the railroad disturbed the ground in the first place, if it pulled her into sight, then maybe she was tied to that line while it was active, and once the train stopped running, maybe whatever held her there loosened. Water never stopped. That waterfall has been running since long before the war, long before the railroad, long before anyone carved a path through these mountains. Maybe she wasn't tied to steel at all. Maybe she was tied to disruption. And when you lay all it side by side, what stands out isn't one dramatic encounter, it's repetition. Different decades, different people, same description. A woman in white, long dark hair, sometimes a lantern. Sometimes she carried something close to her side. Some said she had no head. Others were more careful how they described it. Not everyone used that word, but enough did that it became part of the legend. And here's where the railroad ties back to the Civil War version. If she was buried on that property after her sudden tragic death, and if an Appalachian witch placed a binding over that ground to keep what happened there contained, then the coming of the railroad would have broken that. Now, there are other variations of the legend of the Creekfield Woman. Some say an orb drops from the sky in a certain spot, and that orb becomes the figure of a woman, sometimes with her head, sometimes without. Some versions blend together over time, and folklore does that. And one more thing, that name, Creekfield, it's not common, not then, not now, but Critchfield and Crutchfield was. There were men with those last names in the area during the Civil War. Men who served in regiments that would have passed through the battles this story ties to. Men with those last names who also appear in the census records from that time. And if you're from Appalachia, you already know how names shift here, like how Tugwell becomes Tuggle, how Shoemaker becomes Shoemake. Words get shortened, sounds drop off. We don't always say things the way they're spelled, so it's possible the name changed over time. Richfield to Creekfield, not because someone lied, because that's just how language moves in these mountains. And once a name settles into a story, it stays. And while I stood there in Taylor's Valley, the fog rolling in, and the sound of that river moving through the community, I kept thinking about how long that valley has carried people through it. Native trails, wagon roads, rail lines, bicycle paths. Every generation builds something across it, and every generation thinks that what they built is permanent. But the only thing permanent is the valley and this story. After I left the community center and the park with the old railroad car, I drove a little further towards where the trail bends back into the woods. It was darker by then, not completely night, but close enough that the tree line had started blending together. I didn't walk far, just enough to stand there and listen. There were no trains, no cyclists, no voices carrying down the grade, just the steady sound of water moving somewhere beyond the trees. And for a moment, I thought I heard something. Not loud, not dramatic, just what sounded like gravel lightly crunching behind me, the way it does when someone takes a careful step. I didn't turn around. Maybe I didn't want to. Maybe I knew nothing was going to be there. Or maybe I was afraid something might be. But that's when it settled in for me. Every version of this story, they all share something in common. She's never chasing anyone. She's never attacking. She's never speaking. She's just there, walking, standing, sitting, brushing her hair, or holding her head. And maybe that's the part that sticks with people. Not fear, presence. No one ever went looking for her, but they keep seeing her. And here in Appalachia, that matters. Because around here, we understand that not everything loud is dangerous, and not everything quiet is harmless. Some things are just woven into the land. The war passed through Taylor's Valley. The railroad cut through it. Hurricane Helene tore through it. And each time, the community rebuilt. The trail is being reconstructed now, and people will ride it again. Families will gather at the diner. Kids will play in that park beside the old railroad car. Life keeps moving forward. That's what roots do. They hold steady. They dig deep. They survive what comes. But shadows do something different. Shadows don't always mean darkness. Sometimes they just mean something was there before you. Something that hasn't completely let go. Something that moves when the light shifts. And Taylor's Valley carries both. It carries its roots, the families, the farms, the community that depends on that trail reopening and thriving again. And it carries its shadows, the stories that refuse to fade, the footsteps heard on gravel, the woman in white who keeps close to whatever path runs through that stretch of land. The war ended, the railroad left, the storm came and went, but she kept walking. And maybe that's not something to be afraid of. Maybe it's just something to remember. And whether her name was Creekfield or Crutchfield or something else entirely, Taylor's Valley still keeps her. Here in Appalachia, we don't always need proof for a story to live. We don't always need a marker in the ground. Sometimes a place remembers what happened, even when the story stopped being told. The railroad left. The storm came and went. But some say Miss Creekfield never did.
Back up in the mountains, where I grew up as a kid, there were legends told among us, but one I won't forget. She's called the Creekfield Woman. I still remember well, Creekfield Woman.
This has been Roots and Shadows, the Real Appalachia podcast, where every root tells a story and every shadow hides one. As a reminder, these stories are drawn from public records, historical reporting, and conversations passed down through families, neighbors, and memories. Some names have been changed, and where the written record goes quiet, details have been carefully dramatized for storytelling.
Back up in the mountains where I grew up as a kid, there were legends told among us, but one I won't forget. She's called the Creekfield Woman. I still remember well, Creekfield Woman. Her spirit here still dwells.